But I tried. Welcome to this wonderful event we have with Dr. Ken Schoon. He is going to share with us Calumet beginnings. He has had a lifelong career researching and sharing. That's really the key. All the wonderful knowledge we have of the history, both geological and cultural, of our wonderful area, the dunes. Mm-hmm. So I'm Heidi Studebaker, and this is a presentation by the Dune Acres Historical Commission to have Ken come out and talk to us today. So we're going to have a wonderful presentation, and there'll be time for questions, and just let us know if you need anything. We're so happy. So thank you. Thank you, Ken.
Okay. I like your comment about sharing, because the sharing came before anything else. My dad belonged to a group at Lakes of the Four Seasons that they called the Teenagers, and he asked me to come and do a program about the geology of the area. And okay, I'd have to put something together. And he noted that the folks in his group kind of liked it when they were illustrated lectures. So I would have to find some photos and maps and copy them. And 20 years ago, copying wasn't as easy as it is today. But I got a program put together. I was very pleased with it. And I showed it to the teenagers. And one fella at the end asked, where could he go to learn more about this? So, I don't know. I just searched through all the stuff I could find, and you got a summary of it all. But what it told me was that I needed to write a book. I needed so that he'd have an answer, and if anybody else asked, I'd have something to tell them. And I wasn't used to doing that kind of thing. But fortunately, I was married to a reference librarian and a copy editor. And so the two of us went to work on it. And in 2003, we came out with the book Calumet Beginnings. And it's now in its 7th printing. And after 20 years, it's still available in bookstores and from Indiana University Press. So, what I'd like to do is tell you a little bit about it. And I'm going to start with a map of Indiana and Illinois, and just a little bit of Michigan up there. And just looking at that map and the fact that you've already read down here where it says glacial geology, the colors are different than most of the maps of Indiana and Illinois that you will have seen. To me, the most obvious thing when I look at it is the fact that the left side and the bottom has different colors and sort of less minute detail than the right, the upper right part. And that's because the pink area was glaciated a long, long time ago. Actually, the whole map area was glaciated a long time ago. In a time period that geologists like to call the Illinoian Ice Age. Illinoian because you can find a lot of evidence in Illinois. And after that, then the Wisconsin Ice Age occurred, and it wasn't as big. It didn't cover as much land as the Illinoian. So, whereas the Illinoian got down to the Ohio River in a couple of places, the brown and mainly the browns that you see up here was land that was covered by the ice during the later, in fact, the last ice age, which was the Illinoian. And it got as far as, that's Indianapolis. And notice that neither one of them got to Bloomington. And if you're familiar at all with Bloomington, you know that Bloomington and Nashville, Indiana have a landscape that is very different from Morocco and Rensselaer and Indianapolis and Kokomo, sort of the flat, wonderful farmland that Indiana is famous for. This area that is gray down here was never glaciated by any of the glaciers during the Ice Age. And it's very likely that all of this area looked much like the Bloomington area before the Ice Age, with the hills and the valleys and the thin layers of soil. So why the brown lines? The dark brown lines are moraines. How many folks in here know what a moraine is? Probably less than half. Very good. You can tell me if I'm wrong. Imagine the glacier coming south from this area here, and it got this far south to the extent. That's as far as it went. Why didn't it go any further? Well, the farther south the glacier went, the warmer the land would be. It's close, you know, it was still, during the Ice Age, there were still 4 seasons. It's just that summer wasn't hot enough to melt the ice that had been previously. But there was warmer weather in the sun. In the summer, the sun was up for longer, just as it is today in the summertime. So what is happening is the edge of the ice is in an area where there's a lot of melting of the ice, while the glacier is still pushing more ice south. And so with the right temperatures, the glacier will be sort of in equilibrium. More ice is coming south, being pushed from Canada, but the glacier itself isn't getting any larger because the southern edge of it is melting at the same rate that it's coming south. But the glacial ice is really dirty. It is pushing or incorporating all the rocks and sand and dead animals and bones and leaves and whatever was on the ground up in Canada and in Michigan got pushed south. So if the edge of the ice is staying in one place for a while with ice melting at the same rate that was coming, the sand and the boulders and anything that isn't ground a bit by the ice is going to be dumped at the edge of the glacier. And so it creates a band of hills or a ridge at the end of the glacier, and it marks where it is. Now, the glaciers were here a long time ago. We can use these ridges, these moraines, to know how far the glaciers got. You don't have to see it. Just like when I went to work at IUN, if it was a bad snowstorm and I pulled off Broadway onto 33rd Avenue, I could tell if the parking lot had been plowed. And I could see where the snow was that had been plowed. If I look real carefully and look for tracks, I might even know what direction the plow was going. But I couldn't tell you what color the plow was. And I couldn't tell you how fast the plow was moving. But I could see what work it had done. Both of the glaciers are very much the same. We can see that the extent of the Wisconsin glaciers was here. And it built up a moraine at its edge. And then the ice melted back, but the Ice Age wasn't over. And we have cold weather and warm weather. So when the weather got warmer, then the ice started melting faster than it was coming south, and the ice melted back. And then it would get colder again, and the ice marches south again. And builds another moraine, but not as far south or as far west as previously. Then the ice would melt back, and if it came forward again, it could form and did another moraine, and later still another moraine, and another moraine, another moraine, and the last one is this moraine here that we call the Valparaiso moraine. Why do we call it the Valparaiso moraine? Because it's so easy to see it in Valparaiso. And geologists like to name things like this after a place, not after a person. Not after the person who figured it out, but after a place so other people 100 years later can still sort of find it. So notice that this glacier that came down to Lake Michigan formed a bunch of things here, but these moraines indicate there was another lobe of the glacier that came from the northeast. And it got probably about this far south, and then these are its recessional moraines back to Lake Erie. So the ice begins to melt from the Valparaiso moraine, and that was a very important thing because the meltwaters were blocked. They couldn't go south because the moraine sort of formed a dam. They couldn't go east or west because the moraine was a U-shape. And the meltwaters couldn't go north because the ice was still there. So the water was trapped around the melting glacier and formed the very beginnings of Lake Michigan. However, and you can imagine this, the glacier, the moraine is uneven, and as the water level gets higher because more ice melts, it's going to go over the moraine wherever the moraine was the lowest. Anywhere along there, wherever the low part is, the water is going to start pouring out. And the low part happened to be over here on the west side, 2 areas, and the water's poured out. We call it the Chicago outlet, but of course there was no Chicago at the time. And then the water's poured over the moraine and down the Illinois River to the Mississippi, and down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. So Lake Michigan drained to the Gulf of Mexico, not to the North Atlantic as it does today. But the Ice Age wasn't over, and I don't want to talk about all of Indiana and Illinois. What I really want to do is talk about this area at the south end of the lake that we call the Calumet region, which includes some Illinois, as you can see, and a lot of Indiana. Well, excuse me, a lot of it is in Indiana. And so I'm going to blow that up. And here, imagine about 17,000 years ago, that's years before the present. The ice is here, the Valparaiso moraine is being formed here. Dune Acres is under ice. Way up there, current shoreline doesn't exist yet. And the Kankakee Outwash Plain is where the meltwaters from the ice in the summertime would flow south, forming rivulets and its own little channels through the Valparaiso moraine itself, and then slowing down when it got past the moraine and forming what is now known as the Kankakee Outwash Plain. As the melting water is moving quickly, it can carry sand, it can carry clay, it can maybe carry small pebbles and things like that. Not those great big boulders you see at the end of people's driveways. The ice could push that along, but not the running water, probably. So a lot of this, as the water would come off the glacier, carrying lots of sand and silt and clay and stuff, it would drop the sand right away as the water slowed up. And when it got into the Kankakee Outwash Plain, it would hardly carry any sand out of the plain. And today, the Kankakee area is very, very sandy. In fact, there are more sand dunes around the Kankakee River than there are around Lake Michigan. But they're not as big. They're not as beautiful. Nobody puts a clubhouse at the top. But what you will see at the top are farmhouses. And the farm boys used to spend a lot of time looking for Indian arrowheads, because that's where the council grounds would be, up on those little sand dunes above the Kankakee marshy area. So the ice melted back from the Valparaiso moraine and formed the very beginnings of glacial Lake Michigan. Notice Dune Acres is still under ice. But then the ice expanded, it got cold again, and a second moraine was put on top of the Valparaiso moraine. At first, nobody could tell the difference between the two. Now we know that there was the Tinley moraine, notice named for an Illinois city, was deposited north of the Valparaiso, and probably a good deal of it on top of the Valparaiso moraine. And then the ice melted back, and at that point the level of Lake Michigan was at 640 feet. We know that because we can see the beach today. And you've seen it most likely. How many of you have eaten at some time in your life at Tebow's restaurant? Then you have eaten at a lakeshore restaurant. Tebow's in Schererville is on the beach. The beach was there 14,000 years ago. The restaurant's only been there for 100 and some. It's been more than 100, I think. But US 30 at that point, not the whole US 30, but at that point US 30 was built on the beach. It was the Lincoln Highway. And then north of the highway, north of US 30, the ground slopes down into what had been the bottom of Lake Michigan at the time. And that's where you'll find Walmart and Strachan Van Til's and other stores. Well, the ice melted, yeah, but then it got cold and the ice advanced one third time, but this time formed a moraine that were really islands in the middle of Lake Michigan. And when the ice melted back from that, these were the islands. The best one known by its name is Blue Island, and that's because the town built there was named Blue Island also. Glenwood Island is next to the town of Glenwood. Hobart Island is, well, actually it's where Merrillville is today. But when these were named, there was no Merrillville. So it got the name Hobart Island because that was the largest place nearby. This part here is in today's Hobart. This part is in today's Merrillville. And then these were areas along what is now the Indiana Dunes region, but still south of Dune Acres. I wanted to show you pictures of what this area might have looked like when the first settlers came in. And this picture was this drawing, it's a pencil and paper kind of drawing that was published in 1876. You can get a copy of it at the Valparaiso Public Library. It's in a big atlas. There are several pictures of what the area looked like back in 1876 when the atlas was published. And this is a picture. It shows parts of the Valparaiso moraine, which is hilly, and then a flat area here, so it might have been somewhere along the edge of the moraine. Notice all the trees are in straight lines. And that is because either there was an orchard there, or the artist liked drawing pictures of trees in straight lines. And that's how he indicated a forest. We don't know what his intent was. This is one of the lakes north of Valparaiso, Spectacle Lake, and the building on the far side is an ice house. Not a house made of ice, but a house intended to keep ice cold through the spring and into the summer, because at Spectacle Lake and a lot of the other lakes around here, but not Lake Michigan, people went out in wintertime with saws and cut the ice and took it into the shore so that they could sell it in the spring, summer, and winter. Not winter, spring and summer. Well, the Crown Point phase of the glaciation basically ended about 14,300 years before the present. And the first shoreline along the beach is called, where there was actually a beach, which is in yellow here. It was called the Glenwood shoreline because of this little village of Glenwood down here. And this part of the beach is Joliet Street in the town of Schererville today. In fact, if you're at all familiar with this was the Lincoln Highway, an old US 30, now Joliet Street, and this is all a commercial area. In fact, I think this house is where Computer Bay is today. Well, the wind blows. Nothing stopped the wind from blowing during the Ice Age or at the end of it. And when wind blows over Lake Michigan, the friction between the wind and the water causes waves. And these waves come crashing against the shore. And I hope all of you have taken some time to sit on the sand and watch the waves as they come in. And the waves will carry sand and dump it on the shore. And depending on the activity of the waves, they can also take sand away from the shore. And the waves of Lake Michigan created a number of peninsulas that geologists call spits. Don't ask me why they call them spits. Almost nothing in the scientific literature is one syllable, first of all. And nothing is as glorious a thought as spit, but that's what they're called. And this spit here was fairly long, where the waves were coming down this way and pushing the sand up onto it. When it's underwater, it's a name's not coming to me. A ridge underwater.
Sandbar? Sandbar.
Sandbar, yes. Thank you. Thank you. But there are spits along Glenwood and Homewood and the area south of US 30 excuse me, US 20 in Porter County. Oops, pressed the wrong button. And the Glenwood Spit actually got lengthy, got all the way down to the Griffith area. And this is today Griffith, Indiana. And one of the important things that it did there as far as human history is concerned is this peninsula served as a breakwater. So the waves of Lake Michigan are building the spit, but they're not coming back here anymore. They're protected. And so we have names for those. Chesterton Bay, Hobart Bay, Chicago Heights Bay on this side. And the reason that's important to us is because the glacial clay was never covered by sand, not much sand. So the clay was pretty close to the surface, which made it extremely accessible if you want to make brick. And in the pioneer time, where people had log cabins, it's not healthy to have a log chimney. And so bricks were important from the early days, and there would always be somebody who found clay close to the surface of his farm and would start digging it out and getting some kind of a kiln and making some brick. And eventually the factories got to be fairly good sized. The beautiful brick in the town of Pullman, where I'm a volunteer, I don't mean the common brick, the really fancy red shiny brick in the larger homes, all came from Chesterton Bay. George Pullman was very proud of the fact that the rest of the brick in the town, they made themselves from the clay at the bottom of Lake Calumet. But they didn't have the facility for getting that really nice, shiny, smooth face brick that came from Porter or Chesterton. And of course, Hobart had a brickyard. Hobart's brickyards lasted until well into the 20th century. And, anybody here from Hobart? Dan, can you tell me the name of the Hobart football team?
Brickies.
The Brickies. You laugh. This was a big industry in Hobart. And the guys who played football were heroes in that town because they had good teams. And the high school was very close to the brickyard. And they played in the Bricky Bowl, which was a naturally low area along a former stream. Being a low area, it was easy to put bleachers up. But the high school was too small, and they had to build a new high school. So they turned the old one into a junior high. But they still played football in the Bricky Bowl because that was hallowed ground. Then the new high school got to be too small, and they built a much larger high school out of town, moved the middle school from the old area to what had been the new high school, and sold the old high school, which had been a junior high school, to the police department, where it's now used there, and actually they train officers from other communities at that spot as well. And they built a new football stadium. So what do you name the new football stadium? If you call it the Bricky Bowl, because of the bricks that they got here, the old guys in town who played football would say, that's not the Bricky Bowl. The Bricky Bowl is in the downtown area. But if you don't call it the Bricky Bowl, those same guys will probably complain about the fact that you don't care anything about the heritage of this town. So they decided they wanted to call it the Brickyard, which still gives homage to the old place, but indicates that it's not the same. But unfortunately, there's another place that uses the phrase brickyard and has already trademarked the name. And it's very busy today, unless they've canceled the race. So the Hobart School Board wrote to the Indianapolis Speedway and asked for permission to name their football stadium the Brickyard. And they were told they could do that as long as they promised never to have automobile races there. So onward. About 11,900 years ago, Lake Michigan left from this area completely. The reason why was because the glacier had melted past the Straits of Mackinac, and the weight of the ice had actually pushed the northern part of Lake Michigan down into the ground. And so the level of the straits was lower than it is today, and water just poured out through the north end of the lake and over to the Detroit River, and then into Lake Erie and over Niagara Falls and down to the North Atlantic. To the North Atlantic instead of the Chicago outlet going to the Gulf of Mexico. But you know that the water came back, and that's because the glaciers grew again, blocking the Straits of Mackinac, and the rainwater then pooled and puddled in the old lake basin. But not as high as it used to, and it formed a new shoreline at 620 feet, so that's 24 feet lower than that Glenwood shoreline, and formed a new spit going across through Lake County here. This spit, which grows to this, the Calumet spit, is today Ridge Road, going through Lansing and Munster and Highland and Griffith. In Porter County, the Calumet Phase Beach, or the Calumet Beach, is Route 12, which I followed as I drove here. I was going to take 20 and then turn left on Mineral Springs, but there's a detour, and I didn't want to get onto the expressway in this rain. And so I took the detour, passed the detour, and went up to 12 and took 12 across. And as you all know, you turn left off or right off of 12, the first thing you do is go down into what had been Lake Michigan. And here we are. This is Route 12. And these are some sort of sand dunes that used to be south of Route 12. Sand dunes aren't there anymore because the sand was too easy to truck away and sell to very needy customers that wanted to use that sand generally as fill. And the sand dunes that were at what is now West Beach and along Route 12 were hauled away. The biggest customer was the city of Chicago. And let's see, Lincoln Park and Jackson Park and Grant Park are all built on Indiana Dunes sand. That was all that was all Lake Michigan. The beach of Lake Michigan used to be where the Art Institute is today. And everything east of that has been filled basically with sand from this area. Then, about 10,000 years ago, Lake Michigan disappeared from this area, and the glacier, because again, the ice melted past Mackinac, but it's never been cold enough since then for the ice to come back and block those straits again. So this area for 4,000 years had no Lake Michigan. And all of this ground that is sort of a light yellow, greenish yellow, would have grown plants. You know, seeds would have blown in from the side, and grasses and trees and shrubs and things lived here. And since we're talking 10 to 6,000 years ago, we don't know when the first American Indians came and lived here. But the more sites we find and excavate, the farther back that date goes. And today it's now thought it may be 16,000 years ago when the first American Indians started living in this area. So they would have been very familiar. So the bottom of Lake Michigan would have Indian trails and leftover campfires and things of that sort. But what we do know is that up here, what is still, that's the current shoreline. So up here, which was Lake Michigan, still is Lake Michigan, was an oak forest. We know it was an oak forest because we can see it. And as with the glaciers gone from the Straits of Mackinac, northern Michigan began to rebound. Just like you take a basketball, you push your hand down in it, you can move that leather down into the ball, but you remove your hand, and the ball assumes its original shape. So the same thing happened with the crust of the earth. The glaciers pushed down on the crust, glaciers are gone, the crust rebounds. So every year the Straits of Mackinac are a little higher than it was the year before by centimeters. You know, it's not a great deal. But given 8,000 years, it's a significant amount of time. And so the lake got down to about this place where we could call it a lakeside oak forest, but the lake continued to grow, and that became a submerged oak forest. Trees don't grow very well when they're drowned. And yet if you are into scuba diving, you can go down and you can see that the remains of that oak forest today. This is a tree stump. The branches, the leaves have all decayed. I mean, it's been underwater for, what, 6,000 years. But the heavy, thick, hard stump still remains. This one's kind of interesting because this tree was dying before it was flooded. And the inside of the tree had rotted. And I had an ash tree in front of my house that we didn't know the tree was hollow. But when it finally was so sickly that we decided to take it down, then we discovered not only was it hollow, but it could have fallen over in a heavy windstorm, right? And this is one of those parkway trees, so it had been right onto the street. There's a rock in there. Can't explain the rock, except somebody dropped it from a boat. So the ice is gone. The rainwater is still coming down, and rivers are flowing into Lake Michigan. The north part of the lake is rising because of the crustal rebound, and the lake is getting bigger and bigger. It again drowns the area that is today dune acres, and a third spit begins to form that we call the Tolliston Spit. And notice there's no really lagoon south of this spit the way there were of the others, but what there is what is now the floodplain of the Little Calumet River. One of the most flood-prone rivers in the entire state of Indiana, because the beginning of it was perfectly flat. This is Lake Michigan. So this is the same elevation as that. And this is the same elevation as that. Rivers need to go downhill, and the greater the gradient, the faster it'll go. Well, with the Little Calumet River, the gradient originally was 0. And then gradually at the mouth, particularly at the west end, as Lake Michigan shrank, then the water in this beginning of a Little Calumet River would erode a channel and become a little bit lower. And so today we have the Little Calumet River. And north of this, the last area to be filled has one of the most unusual landscapes in the country. And it's got a bad name. It's called dune and swale landscape, or dune and swale topography. I've realized how bad a name that is when I took kids on a hike through, I think it was Miller Woods. And when we were done, one of the kids said, "This is an example of dune and swale landscape?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Where are the sand dunes?" Well, there aren't any. They're sand ridges. Each ridge is a former beach of Lake Michigan. They're parallel beach ridges, but they're not sand dunes. So it should have been called ridge and swale landscape, not dune and swale landscape. But they didn't ask me when they named it. So this area to the north has a lot of those alternating ridges and swales through here, more than 150 of them between, let's say, Morton High School and Hammond and the current beach. Another spit coming from the north on the west side of the lake formed Lake Calumet, which is now separate from Lake Michigan. And George Lake and Wolf Lake were formed in the same manner later. And eventually, the lake got down to the level where it is now, and it's not going to go any lower. Now, we have fluctuations based on weather. You know, when we have a winter with a lot of snow or a summer with a lot of rain, then Lake Michigan is higher. If we have a drought, you know, Lake Michigan is a little lower. But it's not going to go down 25 more feet because the water from here goes up north, still gets its outlet is at the north end of the Straits of Mackinac, but then the water just goes into Lake Huron, which is really the same lake as Lake Michigan. They're the same elevation, and I don't know if there's a special name for a geologist who just studies lakes. That's never been me. But it's like one lake, but then the water goes through the Detroit River into Lake Erie, over Niagara Falls to Lake Ontario, down the St. Lawrence River to the North Atlantic, and Niagara Falls is like a dam that prevents Lake Michigan from getting any lower than its low. If our drought low, it's not going to go down another 25 feet because Niagara Falls, that limestone cliff that the water flows over, has to be eroded out of the way completely before Lake Erie will then be eroded down to a wide river, and Lake Huron and Lake Michigan will get the same. We have dunes on this side of the lake. I've been watching a lot of weather on the television lately, and it's funny, we have beautiful beaches on this side of the lake. But the other side of the lake, where Illinois is and where Wisconsin is, they don't have beautiful beaches. In fact, the only way they can have a beach in Chicago is to put out to build a wave break, so that the moving sand will get deposited in an artificial way. And so you have these sort of man-made peninsulas along Chicago. So you could go, you know, be on sand. But the Evanston area and the Wilmette and Winnetka and Lake Forest all don't have anywhere near the beach quality that we have on this side of the lake. The reason why is because the wind, dunes, I don't know why I'm saying this to you guys. The wind made the dunes. The glaciers made the moraines. The wind makes the dunes, and the wind blowing, when the wind is dry, it mainly comes from the west. Most of our storms come from the west. Sometimes the southwest, sometimes the northwest, and there are some that come from the east. But when we have wind from the east, it's more likely to be wet and rainy than wind from the west. And so when you have dry beach sand and the wind from the west is blowing, then that sand is blown away from the beach into hills that we call dunes. The waves do the same thing on this side. They wash sand up onto the beach, and then on a nice hot summer day when the wind picks up, it blows that sand right back into Lake Michigan. So there aren't dunes over there. And that's why Chicagoans come here when they want to go to the dunes. This photo of the dunes was taken in 1910, I think. And I could have said it was a black and white picture taken 3 years ago, and you couldn't believe me. Now, what's interesting, that's the geology part. The human history part that's what's fascinated me, is how the geology and the history work together. And it's an area where, when I was at IU, we have geologists who know far more about geology than I do, and historians who know a lot more history than I do. But how the two react, they don't know the other field. And that's what I found most fascinating. These heavy black lines that go east and west are the former and current shoreline of Lake Michigan. And there was no need to worry much about that. These were all Indian trails. But in 1837, the government started sending stagecoaches from Michigan City, but before that, east of that, Detroit, across the state of Michigan to Michigan City, and then around to the city of Chicago. The most obvious trail is the beach. If you're in Michigan City today and you want to go to Chicago, if you want to walk, as long as Lake Michigan's to your right, you'll get there. If you go far, if you don't run out of steam or don't get arrested by going into the steel mills. There's a path along the Grand Calumet River, but then this path is along the Tolleson shoreline. It's about 169th Street in Hammond. It goes in front of Purdue Calumet and the Morton High School, 15th Avenue in Gary. Then there's Ridge Road, which goes along Route 12 here in Porter County. It is not Route 12 in western Porter County. If you're in the Portage area, the beach is not on Route 12, doesn't follow the beach there. But Ridge Road is definitely on the Calumet Beach Trail. And then the Sauk Trail, which is a very, very long trail, but as it goes through the area at the south end of Lake Michigan, it naturally follows the Glenwood Beach. Why? Because the beaches are, if you're going to walk from east to west 10, 20 miles, the beaches are flat. No hills to climb, very few streams to cross. The north-south trails were a lot harder to figure, and they weren't anywhere as well noted. People going on a north-south trail this time of year or in June could easily get lost because you couldn't really see where the trail was. That wasn't the case for the east-west ones because they were built on those beaches. I live close to Ridge Road, and these arrowheads were purchased. These arrowheads were found on a farm in Munster, not far from where I live, where Jewel Osco is today at Calumet Avenue and Ridge Road. And these were just found by the kids, you know, when they would be out plowing, their eye would catch one of these arrowheads. This one, Kathy, was found by John Heimbaugh, Heine's son. They had a house that was on top of the beach ridge, smack dab on top. In fact, when I saw John at one point at a conference in Portage, and we were chatting, and I said, he said he lived on Greenwood, and I said, north or south of Ridge Road? He said, south. I said, are you north or south of the ridge? He said, I'm at the top of the ridge. I didn't know his name yet, but I was able to call him Mr. Heimbaugh, and that was him. Well, as a kid, he found that when construction crew was removing the driveway and fixing the ground to put in a new driveway, and they found the axe head or hammer. Now, all of this and the landscape, notice that the Mississippi River and the Ohio River and the Wabash River and the Illinois River all flow south. You'd be amazed how many people think that the rivers flow south because south is down. I spent 3 weeks this January in Egypt and had 3 days sailing south but upstream on the Nile River. And that's, of course, the example that is always given to kids when they admit that they had that misconception. But the reason why is because during the Ice Age, this northern part was all covered with ice. The only way the meltwater could escape was to go south, away from the glacier. Well, that also provided highways for the Indians and for the pioneers that came into this area. And there aren't any rivers from the east coast that come into Indiana. There's a mountain range in between. So the colonies, the 13 American colonies, were pretty well sandwiched in between the mountains and the ocean. Florida was Spanish, and of course, New France, up near Montreal, was French. The French government decided they wanted to know more about this river that flowed south, that was west of anywhere that European explorers had ever been. So they got one of their soldiers, one of their officers, whose name was Louis Joliet. Americans insist on pronouncing the name Joliet. And he got about 30 recruits to go with him, and they wanted a chaplain, so they asked a Jesuit named Marquette if he would go with them as the chaplain. But also, as an interpreter, because he had been in North America long enough that he knew many of the Indian languages. So they headed up the Fox River and down the Wisconsin River to the Mississippi River and down the Mississippi River, which they realized that was the big river that the Indians talked about. And when they got down to what we now know as the mouth of the Arkansas River, they decided not to go any further, because this area down here was Spanish. You remember, there were no boundaries, no set boundaries or walls or anything like that yet. But the early explorers could easily tell how far north or south they were in longitude, because your longitude is exactly the same as the height of the North Star over the horizon. At the North Pole, which is 90 degrees of longitude, the equator is invisible, but the North Star is straight up or 90 degrees up from the horizon. At the equator, it's at 0. And we're about 41.5 degrees. If you look at the North Star, it's 41.5 degrees north of the equator, which means our longitude is 41.5. The Spanish knew that. They had maps. The French knew that. Marquette and Joliet knew that they were getting pretty close to the Gulf of Mexico, and at that point decided to go back. And on their way back, the Indians showed them a new way. Look here, you can see going up the Illinois rivers instead of down the Fox River. And they sort of did that. There was a shortcut to get back to St. Ignace, which was the Jesuit home. And then Joliet went back to Montreal, where he was stationed, and he had all of his logs with him in his canoe. He wrote extensive descriptions of everything they saw. It was like the William and Clark expedition, but earlier, much earlier. Montreal exists where it is because that's where the rapids are. Rocks in the middle of the road. You can't get boats around it. And the water starts going very fast and uneven. And so ocean-going boats could come up to Montreal, and then you'd have to get out and get on a different boat on the other side of the rapids to get into the Great Lakes. Joliet is going downstream, getting close to Montreal, gets to the rapids, loses control of the canoe. The canoe tips over. All of his records fell into the water and have never been found. He had a good memory, so when he got back to his camp, he rewrote everything as much as he could from memory. But he never had been able to figure out what else they did. So Marquette came back the next year by himself, actually with three of them, two assistants. He came back as a missionary. And he got as far as the village of Kaskaskia, where he celebrated Mass on Easter Sunday morning, but he got very, very ill. And so he didn't go any further. He decided to go back north. And again, the Indians showed him a shortcut. And so he followed the Little Calumet River over to the Lake Michigan, Little Calumet River to the Grand Calumet River, and up to Lake Michigan, getting into the lake where Marquette Park is today. And that's not a coincidence. And then got up as far as the Paramarquette River in Ludington, where he died. And his body was later taken up to St. Ignace and buried at the mission there. But all the buildings there were wooden, and we don't know where his grave is. So how did he get there? He came up Thorn Creek, which goes right past the quarry here. And then when he got to the Little Calumet River, he went west to the Blue Island area, and then east across Lake County to here, which would have been where the Grand Calumet River then emptied into the lake. Then very likely Marquette stopped right around here where Dunes Creek is today, and the third trip at where Trail Creek ends, going about 13 miles each day in a canoe. He was sick, he couldn't paddle, but his two assistants did all the paddling. And Marquette Park today has this statue of Father Marquette that you see when you enter the park. It's not the way he looked at the time, where he had to be lifted in and out of his canoe because he didn't have the strength to walk. If we were in Michigan City, I would have to talk to you about the Marquette Spring, because of the folklore is that Marquette went to the spring and blessed it, and it's been called the Marquette Spring by the Indians ever since, and now by the white man. I don't think he had the strength to do all that, but don't say that to anybody from Michigan City. Within a few years, LaSalle was a lot more energetic, and he went up and down all these rivers, including the Mississippi River, all the way to the Gulf, up and down the Kankakee River, and he labeled everything that was drained by the Mississippi River to be New France, or named after the king, Louis or Louisiana. So all of this area was French. During the French and Indian War, the French went home because they lost. And the British and the American forces, George Washington fought for the king, for King George during the French and Indian War. And they defeated the French, and all the Jesuits and the French military men all went back to France. And all of this became British, and France sold everything west of the Mississippi to Spain before the war. Then in 1776, the Declaration of Independence was signed. That wasn't signed here in Indianapolis. There was nobody from Indiana who signed it. There was nobody from Kentucky who signed it, nobody from Michigan or Illinois who signed it. There wasn't a Cook County yet. But, you know, as a result of the British ceded the 13 colonies to the new United States. But the question was, what was going to happen to the area on the west side of those mountains? There weren't any rivers that the Americans had found. I mean, it was French exploration, but it didn't belong to France anymore. But during the war, the state, Virginia had no western boundary. If you imagine the state of Virginia, the southern boundary is a straight line, and they took that all the way to the Mississippi River. And then the northern line goes diagonally, and they took that to the Mississippi River. So Virginia basically would tell you that they owned all of this. To make their claim stronger during the war, they sent a militia in 1779 to the Mississippi River, doubled back, surprised the British at Fort Vincennes, and captured the fort, defeated the British. And at the Treaty of Paris, after the Revolutionary War, they said all of this belongs to the United States because of that victory. So who was the Virginian? Anybody, no, don't say it out loud, please. Does anybody know who the Virginian was who made this area U.S. instead of British? I asked, by the way, the first time I ever showed these slides were to my class, captive audience. You're here because you want to be. But I had a blonde woman sitting over here in the front. Tick I knew. And when I gave them the name, her face turned beet red. And she said, "Oh, I should have known that." I said, "Yes," because his name was George Rogers Clark. Bill Clark's brother, by the way, who was with the Lewis and Clark expedition. But George Rogers Clark. And why did this woman turn red? Because she was a teacher at George Rogers Clark High School. I talked a little earlier about the ridge and swale landscape. The west side of Gary was full of it, north of 15th Avenue. I went to a high school in Gary that was built on one of the ridges, and immediately south was a swale that was filled with water. We called it a lagoon. That lagoon was there for decades. It had swans year-round. If you have a picture of my high school, you always took it with swans in the picture. Nobody in the 12 years I went to that school told me why it was there. Nobody told me about ridge and swale. Nobody told me about the fact that that pond was the leftover of a swale. Nobody told me. I didn't know that until my dad asked me to do a program for the teenagers. And then I found, oh, that's my school. Learned about it. Well, here we are. That Union Jack is going to disappear, and it's going to become American. But before that happened, we actually had, within earshot of this building, a battle of the Revolutionary War. Of the Revolutionary War. And the amazing thing is, if you want to win a bet someday, the American forces were led by a man whose name was Tom Brady. You can call all of these guys who fought the British patriots. So Tom Brady was, of course, a patriot. In 1780, Tom Brady had been to Fort St. Joseph, which was originally a French fort and then a British fort, and was heading back. That's Fort St. Joseph. He was heading back to Illinois, and the British caught up with him at probably the mouth of Fort Creek, which would be that little creek that flows into Lake Michigan at Dune State Park. You know, it's often tanned, a brownish color from the tannin from the oak leaves. But Le Petit Fort, which we know was in that area, but we don't know where it was because it was wooden and abandoned, but American forces do describe it, looked like a fort because it had a stockade around it in the dunes, probably up high on one of the dunes, like this building. And the reason there was a stockade was not to fight the enemy, but to keep the deer away from the vegetable garden. But the Battle of Trail Creek, that puts the battle over in LaPorte County. In the aftermath of George Rogers Clark's conquest, skirmishers from Calumet, led by Captain Hamlin and Lieutenant Tom Brady, who had raided Fort St. Joseph, were defeated and captured here by the fur trader Champion and Potawatomi, allies of the British. That's at Trail Creek. You can see that historical marker there. But if you go to Dune State Park, you'll see this one that says, at Le Petit Fort, near this site, a battle which was fought on December 5th, 1780, between American forces under the command of Lieutenant Thomas Brady and Jean-Baptiste Tomlin, and British forces under the command of, I can't read that, something or other. Because the official records refer to the creek, but none of these creeks had been named yet. So both LaPorte County and Porter County claim to have that, and neither source is described in Indiana history books that our fourth graders read in school. Probably because the British won. But in any case, the very next month, the Spanish ended up leaving San Luis, St. Louis, and headed up the Illinois River and through Lake and Porter County up to the fort. And the British weren't there at the time, so they took down the Union Jack, put up the Spanish flag, took down the Spanish flag the next morning and went home. And the Spanish said that the Midwest needed to be them, needed to be Spanish, just like it was west of the Mississippi River. But I think the French and the Americans and the British at the Treaty of Paris, that would have included Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, probably laughed at them. You were there one night. That doesn't count. So this became American, and Indiana and Illinois became part of the United States. And this was the Northwest Territory, because it was north of Kentucky, basically. And that's why Northwestern has that name. It's northwest of what? Well, it's northwest of Virginia. So Thomas Jefferson thought this area should have maybe 5 states. It's big enough to have 5 states. And he used geological information to designate them. We'd have 3 states south of this line and 2 states north of that line. That line being the southern tip of Lake Michigan. And you know that in Porter County as Beam Street in Porter, or in Chesterton and in Gary, it's Indian Boundary Road. And that was the boundary between the Indiana Territory down here and the Michigan Territory north of that line. Notice I used the phrase down here. I try not to do that. Down, I should have said to the south. And then this is going to be 3. Let's start with the high point of the Ohio River here, and divide this area into 3 states. Future state boundaries specified by the ordinance of 1787. The line between Indiana and Illinois, or State Line Road in Lansing and Munster, goes straight south to the city of Vincennes, and not only straight south to the city of Vincennes, straight south to the old Capitol building. So in 1803, this became Ohio, this became the Indiana Territory, all the way up to Canada, and this was the Michigan Territory. And everybody was happy with that. And then in 1816, notice that the Indiana northern boundary line got moved. But it used to be, and I'm going too long, Dan. It used to be the southern tip of Lake Michigan, but that's obviously not the southern tip of Lake Michigan anymore. Because people could recognize that this part of Indiana could be very valuable. A port could be there, big city. Remember, Chicago didn't exist yet. And so in Congress, the Indiana delegation convinced everybody to make the northern boundary of Indiana 10 miles north of that line. Michigan objected, but Michigan wasn't a state, and Michigan had no vote. And so Congress approved, and Indiana became a state with that extra 10 miles. We, by the way, are in Michigan, in what had been the Michigan Territory, because we are north of Beam Street, which is the line that follows that territorial boundary. Well, Illinois decided they could, if Indiana could get 10 miles, if they asked for 60, would Congress give it to them? They asked for 60, and Congress said, yeah, no argument. So they got 60 miles north of the southern tip of Lake Michigan. And Michigan was given both sides of the lake. Then, oh yes, that's dot here marks the monument that was built on the boundary between Indiana and Michigan. Excuse me, between Indiana and Illinois. And that monument still stands in the same place. You can't get to it from Indiana because of industrial stuff. You have to go into Illinois and you go to Calumet Park, and then you go as far south in Calumet Park as you can, and you'll get to this monument with nice manicured lawn and all now. The Calumet generating station used to be there. That was actually in Indiana, but you only could get to it from Illinois. Well, some engineer or no, some surveyor made a mistake. And the southern tip of Lake Michigan was a few miles further south than they thought. What does that do? Does that mean that Indiana and Illinois and Ohio all have to change their boundaries? Well, Ohio said no. Michigan said yes. And Indiana and Illinois did have their northern parts chunked off because that was more than 10 miles. And Ohio had been investing heavily in a port at the east end of Lake Erie, a port in a town that they called Toledo. Spanish name interesting. But this the change in the boundary put Toledo in Michigan. And Ohio got upset when Michigan started charging tax to the people who were building the port. And so the governor of Ohio sent the militia up to defend Toledo. The governor of the Michigan Territory sent the Michigan Toledo south, the Michigan Defense Fund south. There could have been the first war between the states right there, but common sense prevailed and they redrew the line. Still, the line had to point, according to the ordinance, to the southern tip of Lake Michigan, but nobody said it had to be due east-west. So the line today is a diagonal line that puts Toledo in Ohio. Toledo, Ohio sounds right. Toledo, Michigan just doesn't sound right at all. That left, so Michigan got lost 3 times. So as a consequence, they were given the northern tip, the upper peninsula we call it now. That left Wisconsin with all of this land, but by this point in the 1830s, the United States has now purchased from France the Louisiana Purchase, and Minnesota is growing, and Minnesota wanted frontage on the Great Lakes. So Congress gave Minnesota the land that was north of Lake Superior, and Wisconsin got what was left. Wisconsin is still larger than Indiana. Early stagecoach routes, and I'm coming close to an end here, followed the lake shore. As I said, if you had the lake to your right, you wouldn't get lost, but dry sand is not. You ever tried to pull a wagon with kids in it over sand? I mean, the wheels don't want to turn. The stagecoaches were the same, so they had to have an interior route to get from Detroit and Michigan City to Chicago. And so what they did, the early stagecoach routes followed the old Indian trails. And then those stagecoach routes then became highways, and Ridge Road became US Highway 6, and this became US Highway 30 after it was the Lincoln Highway for a while. And there's a picture of one of the stagecoach inns that was built along the Ridge Road, this one in Munster. The largest, what all of this did was make it easy to start selling the sand. Because people were moving in here, the railroads came in, ice harvesting we've already talked about. All of those were little businesses until the railroads came in. You could then fill railroad cars with sand and haul it out. You could fill 10 cars in one day and haul it out, and they'd be at their customer the next day. This is what a railroad map of Lake and Porter County looked like in 1910. Far too many railroads. There's far too much competition. The railroads were going broke and merging, and lines were being discontinued. But 1910 was about the most crowded. And you see how many of them come from the Dunes area over here, and then just trucked over to South Chicago. So that's the story of our dunes. The Prairie Club, with those railroads, started coming out here and saying, hey, this is a place we should continue to honor instead of destroy. People came to the beach for fun. This is the 4th of July, 1913. And the rest of the story you know because you live here.
Thank you so much, Ken. It was wonderful. So we can do questions, and then we also, Ken has books for sale, and I do love the Swedish book, especially. I do. And then
it has a picture in it.
The other one, actually, I read recently, the Pullman book. I just really enjoyed it. It was just, it's really an easy read, but it's so interesting about Pullman. So, and then he of course has the Calumet Beginnings book, which is in its...
I suggested the name
Yeah.
Calumet Beginnings, which was Peg's suggestion, actually. And IU Press said, hey, no books have titles like that. I said, but I think this one describes the book. And they agreed, and they've sold 6,000 copies.
Seventh printing, right?
It's the seventh printing now. Dan has one of the
We
first.
got the first edition.
Is that first or second?
Well, 2003.
Well, yeah, but they were both 2003. The first printing was sold out within a few months.
Wow.
Yours is, that first number is 2.
Oh,
So,
you broke my bubble. I carry it around in the car with me because there's landmarks. It talks about every town and location, and
yeah, Dune
You know,
Acres has its own section.
if you're in Glenwood, Illinois, you can look up Glenwood, Illinois, and then there's landmarks that you can find there. So I've read it 3 times and I use it as a reference book.
Can I borrow that just for a second? I'll give it back.
Yeah.
One of the things I insisted on was a color map, which is the same map you saw on the screen. The book was $25. After 5 printings, they realized they couldn't sell them for $25 anymore. So without asking, they went from a hardcover to a soft cover, and they went from the color map to a black and white. I can manage the soft cover. The black and white I couldn't. So if anybody, there are 2 ways to get a color map. One way is to send me an email and say, please send me a color map, and I will. And then you can print it on your printer at home, and you have it. Fold it in half and put it in the book. This is, in fact, that's even better than this because there's a little problem at the middle, being able to read the page.
That's where my lot was, right on.
Yes. And the other way is to buy a book and get a free copy of the map that Dan brought today. How many books?
Limited to 10.
He brought 10 maps. So they go to the first 10 people who want to buy one. But I have the other books as well, including the one that has Heidi's picture in it. So any questions?
How old did you have a picture?
Oh, like 25. It's from the Lucia at the Shelburne Farm.
You asked how many years ago?
Oh, no, don't go there.
Yes.
Everybody here drives through Coles Bog
Yes.
several times a week. Could you maybe get a little description of the bog and how it formed? And
Well, let me go back a couple of pictures.
according to your book, it's 8,000 years old.
This picture doesn't have the little dot with sorry. Dune Acres is right about here, and if you notice, the yellow is the sand dunes, which at this point the Tolliston shoreline and the current shoreline merge. It's just one massive set of sand dunes. And then there's this green area below. And that green area is the former lake bottom. And then you get south to the Calumet shoreline, which is Rock 12. When I turned left off of US 12, I went downhill onto what had been lake bottom and is green on the map. That area was always damp because it's low, and then you get into where the town actually starts, or at least where the developed part of the town starts, and all the sand dunes. So the only way to get into Dune Acres from the south, of course, is to go through that little bit of land here. All of this is marshy, is wet. The Long Lake is part of that. The Beverly Shores area has what they call the Great Marsh, which is between Rock 12 and the higher sand dunes. and Coles Bog is in that area. Coles Bog is another misnomer. It shouldn't have been called Coles Bog. It was honoring Mr. Coles, who did a great deal of research and actually sometimes is referred to as the father of American ecology because of his work here. But it's not a bog. But it was one of the first projects when Save the Dunes Council thought the way to save the dunes was to buy the land. It was far too much land for an organization like Save the Dunes Council to purchase all 17,000 acres of land that is now the national park. But they did start, and they did buy Coles Bog. And they named it Coles Bog, and they got it protected. It's a natural, I forgot what kind of designation it has. Like historic landmarks, you can't fuss with the outside of the house, or you lose your designation. And Coles Bog has one of them too. But they named it Coles Bog, and the federal government kept the name Coles Bog, and so it is Coles Bog, but it is actually Coles Fen. Because a fen and a bog are pretty much the same when you look at it, but the water that gets into it and leaves is different in the two. And I am not a biologist, so I won't go into that because I'll just embarrass myself. But Coles Bog is not a bog, but it's part of this large area. In south of the Tolleson shoreline is the same long green narrow strip that has the Little Calumet River in it, and north of the Calumet shoreline over here, that's the area that there's no river going through it. There could have been maybe, but instead we have a series of wetlands going through that area. That's what goes what. Yes, sir.
So it's probably maybe arrogant is the word to think that now that we've arrived, things have stopped, but of course they haven't. So where do we go from here, like in the next 1,000 or 5,000 years?
Where do we go? You mean what's going to happen to the landscape?
Yeah.
Well, the dunes formed and moved. You know, Mount Baldy is a migrating dune. West Beach has a migrating dune. All of them started out as migrating dunes, where something caused the wind to slow down. So wind is traveling very fast. It's blowing sand, and then something caused something that's got to go over. It could be a rock or a boulder or a tree or a house or something. And so on the far side, there's not going to be much wind, and so the sand will drop, and then build up a small pile. I remember as a freshman being told this in Mark Rushkin's geology class. And when he said that the Indiana sand dunes, which I knew very well from my Boy Scout years, he said that they were built by the sand, and the sand was built of sand, but by the wind. That's not quite possible. But then I grew up. Then I got married, and I bought a house, and we had a really bad series of snowstorms. And my church had invited a guest pastor to come, and after that service we were going to vote to see if we wanted to keep him or not. And he had to drive all the way from Evergreen Park to get there. And I wanted to be there. So Saturday night I shoveled the driveway out completely so that Sunday morning it would be free. Sunday morning I got up, I looked outside, and there was a 4-foot snowdrift that had been blown up overnight. And by the way, the pastor didn't come. He couldn't get in from Evergreen Park. And I said to myself, this is what Dr. Rushkin was talking about. If the wind could blow dry sand into a 4-foot high drift right across my driveway, it could give it thousands of years. It could build some great big sand dunes as well. Now what's going to happen? Most of the sand dunes along here have grass, and when the grass has begun to grow and trees grow on the dunes, it stabilizes them. So they're not going to blow away. There are still some changes. People along Long Beach, east of Michigan City, got really upset when the lake level was kind of low, which meant that there was a lot more beach than usual, and the wind blew them into a sand ridge parallel to the beach, and those poor people living with views of Lake Michigan from their homes, from their ranch homes, couldn't see the lake anymore because this berm was between them and the lake. And so that's a 21st century change. There will be some changes, but one of the things we're trying very hard to do is to fight Mother Nature. I remember 20 years ago, 30 years ago, watching a public television program about the lower Mississippi River and all the problems trying to prevent a river that naturally floods from flooding. And the Army Corps of Engineers had charge of it all, and they asked some fella, "What's your goal?" He said, "Our goal is the same every day, to make sure that there's no flooding today. Tomorrow our goal will be to make sure that there's no flooding tomorrow." He said, "But there will be flooding." And this was before Hurricane Katrina. Lake Michigan still brings sand up. It wants to block the ports. We have to excavate sand to keep our ports open. And when they put a revetment, a dam across into the lake, it causes the water to slow down and deposits the sand. So east of Washington Park in Michigan City, there's sand. In fact, I shouldn't say east of Washington Park. Washington Park and east is a great deal larger every year than it was the year before, because the lake is still depositing sand there and making a very huge beach area, nowhere near as that big when they started it. But on the other side of the pier, the water that used to have all this sand in it now can pick up more sand, and it does, and it causes erosion on the east side. When the federal government put in the port of Indiana, just west of here, sand is being deposited on the east side, and as all the folks at Ogden Dunes know only too well, it's being eroded on the other side. And only last year, the state passed a regulation saying that if you're going to excavate and pick up sand from the bottom, you have to leave it in Lake Michigan. You put it over where it's being eroded. That's the sand. That is the sand that naturally would have gone there. And I thought, they just passed this in the year 2020 or the year 2018 or something like that. They should have done that 200 years earlier. But the Lake Michigan shoreline is changing. It'll continue to change. The lake will still get higher after periods of heavy rainfall or snowfall, and it'll be lower when we have droughts, and that's kind of natural. When it's low, the beachcombers love it. The people who have homes along the lake love it because they have more beach between them and the water. The ship owners hate it because when the lake level is low, the ore boats cannot carry a full load of ore to Cleveland Cliffs or to U.S. Steel. They can only fill the boat to 75%. I'm making that number up of capacity, so that the barge floats at a higher level and can get in without rubbing the bottom of the lake. Because when you rub the bottom of the lake, and you're going very fast, rubbing it in, sometimes it becomes very hard to pull it back out again, which we've seen in the Panama Canal. It was the Panama Canal that had that evergreen barge that got in crooked.
Yeah.
You know, it gets in just a few moments, and then it takes months to get it back out. So that's where an awful lot of the trouble is. As far as the beach areas, the wind blows at Marquette Park and the West Beach, the wind is blowing sand into the parking lot, and we take plows and vacuums and pick it up and put it back on the beach. Mount Baldy, I haven't seen Mount Baldy for a year, but when I saw it last, the north slope of that huge sand dune was right up next to the parking lot. And I have no doubt that it's covering part of the parking lot now. Eventually it will cover the whole parking lot. Then we find another place to park. Because I think that's too much, I can't imagine that there, you know, as that sand dune comes, you're not going to be able to clear it with a plow. Yes, sir.
Can you identify on that map some of the major water courses that are flowing through there? For example, the one that's immediately south of the current shoreline that has the black dot. Is that the Grand Calumet?
This here?
Yes.
This is the Grand Calumet. This is Blue Island. And notice there's some sand dunes around Blue Island, or a few. This is the Little Calumet River. This is Deep River. This is Turkey Creek. This is North Creek in Lansing. Plum Creek. Salt Creek, I think is this. Salt Creek is either this one or that one. I haven't looked at a map for a while. It's goes. The United States Congress and Canada passed a treaty where communities cannot take water out of Lake Michigan. Businesses cannot take water out of Lake Michigan in certain amounts, unless your wastewater goes back into Lake Michigan. And so all these communities up here can have all the water that they want. In Munster, you know, nobody says you don't have so many gallons of water a day because we're, you know, Lake Michigan has lots of water. And sewage goes back into the Grand Calumet River through here or through the Indiana Harbor Canal, which is right here.
And when they put in the U.S. Steel Mill in about 1906,
yeah.
they altered the route of the Grand Calumet River.
They moved this. This is now, this is the way it was then. It is now about half a mile south of that. And the old route of the Grand Calumet is, you know, covered over in steel mill now. These routes became, I mean, the Little Calumet River did a U-turn here and flowed back into Lake Michigan here. But this is where the Cal-Sag Channel was then built, directing the Little Calumet River water to the Gulf of Mexico instead of to Lake Michigan. And the Indiana Harbor, the Illinois and Michigan Canal, again, connecting the Chicago River with the Mississippi. So, thank you for hanging around.
Calumet River flows in two directions, is that right?
Flows in two directions, but it has three mouths. The Little Calumet River, this is the Little Cal. Some of it goes north along the Calumet River and empties into Lake Michigan at 95th Street, or could, depending on the locks that are there. Burns Ditch connects it with the lake here. And the Indiana, let's see, there's 3 segments. So one segment has a mouth here, the other segment has a mouth at the northern end of Burns Ditch. And that means the water from LaPorte County flows west, most of Lake County and eastern Porter County flows east, and then from Munster west, it flows west again. All in one river.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great presentation.
Take care.